It's a beautiful day, which is great for us, but maybe kept some people out in their garden today. But thank you for coming. My name's Carol Baldwin, and I'm on the League of Women Voters of Weston Steering Committee, and help with some of the events like this. And the League of Women Voters is, I wanted to read the mission statement, is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education, civil dialogue, and advocacy. We are a group of women and men who believe in the power of voters to make a difference and advocate for good government at the local and state level and national levels. So we had earlier this year the Speak Up, which brought together our heads of our different town commissions, and so this is we'll probably we will be doing a debate in the fall. So we also co-sponsor some events. So there's an event at the Historical Society right now, which is no longer called the Historical Society. It's called the Weston Art and Culture, or Culture and Art. History and Culture. Okay, I will get it right. History and Culture Center. It's Rise Up Sisters, and today is the last day of that exhibition. So head over. What are the hours today? 1 to 4. Okay, 1 to 4. Also, oops. Oh. That's great. Also, the League of Women Voters of Weston is going to be doing the Betty Hill Forum honoring a wonderful woman in our community who passed away. And we're going to be having it on Friday, June 9th. Thank you. And we'll be having as a speaker Tatiana Serafin, and she is the Carnegie Council Senior Fellow on Ethics in International Affairs. And she does a popular podcast. She's a journalist, and she'll definitely be an interesting speaker. And that's going to be also a luncheon at the Aspetuck Country Club. So let's see. I have other announcements here. We have a membership table over there. If you become a member today, special deal, Anita Dinwoody and her family have offered to buy you a free sweet or savory pie. So, and we have pies over there for sale also. That's from the Old Mill Cafe and Market. That is one of our own Westonites operation, and bakes up delicious items. So let's see. There's some free water on the table over there if anyone's thirsty. And I think those are all my announcements. I've probably forgotten something, but we'll have we have the mic that I think my husband will pass around if you have a question. But I wanted to thank our two legislators that are here. We have Representative Anne Hughes, who represents, let me see if I can get this right, Easton, Reading, and Weston.
That's right.
Okay. And then we have Ceci Maher, who represents Moore Stamford, Wilton, Reading, Weston, Wilton, not Easton, and Ridgefield.
And Westport.
And Westport. So thank you so much for coming. Let's start with Ceci, and I'm just going to ask you both to just, bring us up to date in some highlights of this past legislative session. I know it's not complete yet, but...
Yeah, it's actually pretty early days. But before I get started, I went over to look at the pies, and they're also empanadas and quiches, I heard. And
sweet and savory.
Was last year, and it was so good. So, I had it last year. It was so good. Just putting in a plug. So, the legislative session. Well, it's a little early in the legislative session. For the most part, what we've been working on in the Senate, what we've been voting on in the Senate has been nominees, so judicial nominees. At the very beginning of the session, we voted on the spending cap and the budget cap. And basically, most of the work has been, for me, in committees. I'm the chair of the Children's Committee, vice chair of Higher Education, and then sit on Human Services, Energy and Technology, Judiciary, and Internship. So there's 6 committees. And I've been really focused now on just getting my children's bills all set and finished so that we can bring them out in the legislatures. I brought out a bill this week in the Senate. It was a technical bill. It wasn't, did me a solid for my first bill. They said, just do this technical bill that no one's going to ask you any questions on so that you get used to it, because I stood up and I started speaking and I forgot my microphone. I was like, oh my God, really? But anyway, so a lot of the work that we're doing right now is on Fridays. We're doing caucuses. So each of the different committee chairs, we get all together, all the Democratic senators, and we have a caucus on their bills. So I went a couple weeks ago. Last week we had transportation, environment, planning and development, which is basically municipalities, working with municipalities. And then I'm trying to think what else. Human services, some of the human services and some of education. So I don't want to take all this away because Anne will share some of the same information, but there were about 3,000 bills that were put forth in the beginning of January, and we've whittled them down now to about 750. And the word is that they then whittle down further to around 250 to 300. So there are bills that we know we're going to see, but they haven't come to the Senate yet. And sometimes the bills go to the House first, and sometimes they go to the Senate first. But right now, the bigger bills haven't come through. So I've just been trying to make sure that SB 2, which is the really big children's bill, which is about mental health and other aspects for children, just trying to clean that up, make sure it's ready to go and bring out on the floor. We sent it to appropriations this week so they could look at the fiscal notes. And then when it comes back, we'll tighten it up again and get ready to bring it out.
So I'm State Representative Anne Hughes, proud to represent y'all here in Weston. Shout out to Margaret Wurtenberg, who someday will see this, and she has always hosted this in the past. So I know I just really thank all you for coming out and really being interested in your state level policy, because we really believe that that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of what's happening in the national landscape. So it's really, really important that we have the public engaged in what's happening on the state level here in Connecticut. This is a budget year. So really we're doing this dance not only with the timing, because we end on June 7th and we only have about, 13 or 19 days of session left, or not very many days left to get all the rest of the 700 bills down to 300 passed. But we're in a budget year where we're in a little delicate fight with the governor about moving beyond those spending caps to really fund our nonprofits, our higher education, our our children's mental health, for instance. Speaker's bill is 5001 is the priority, and that's really funding a lot of folks in our IDD community to get them off the wait list. We have some asks in front of Aging Committee, which I've been a member of since the first term, and we're really wanting to provide more services for people aging at home, for people needing services. We just passed a nursing home transparency bill, which is really important because, look, most of the people in nursing homes are publicly funded through Medicaid, and yet these are private nursing homes that sometimes get consolidated, bought up by private equity firms, and they're not spending the money on the direct care that these residents deserve. So we have also some patient staffing ratio bills. Really, I'm on Human Services, Aging, and Labor and Public Employees, but I've also co-sponsored and co-introduced about 200 bills. So I'm tracking all of those at the same time about some of those, wide priorities, because they're not all in committees that I sit on. So really, the budget dance is the biggest impact that we're going to see in some of these services, because it's not enough to just pass a bill if it's not funded and if it's not resourced. And that's where the rubber is hitting the road. And that's where we're trying to offer tax relief. That's why we're trying to offer increased senior tax relief, increased senior tax relief on pensions and Social Security, increase that. We're trying to push our whole team to provide a child tax credit for families raising kids here in Connecticut. It's very expensive. And though a lot of these negotiations are happening in the background, they don't really happen on the floor when a bill comes out, because basically we're in the majority, the Democrats, so when a House bill hits the floor, we think that we have the votes to pass it, or it's not coming out on the floor. How many of those 700 bills are actually going to show up on the House floor? I don't know yet. I'm not in the inner circle of the Speaker's chamber, so I'm not sure. But I am trying to be as transparent and keep you all informed with our e-news and updates, and respond to your emails of asking for support of specific things. So that communication is really important. That's why Ceci and I both publish our cell numbers and make sure that our aides respond when you're calling our office for help, like with DOT or DMV things or other. I get calls a lot for people needing help with different agencies and different commissions, and happy to escalate that on your behalf.
Thanks, Anne. So I think if, Roan, if you want to pass the mic around, if someone has a question, is anyone, you can, yeah, here, there you go. Thanks, Gail.
Hi. Well, this question is for both of you, but Ceci, you might be a little bit better prepared to answer it. I work a lot with a lot of nonprofits that are in the early child care sector, and the number one issue that we hear the most is that they are losing employees and can't provide appropriate child care, particularly in low-income areas, because salaries are just not competitive. So what's happening is they're not getting qualified applicants, they don't have the ability to train them, and once they do train them, they're losing them to either the public school systems or to other careers, because someone simply cannot make a living earning minimum wage doing something like that. Has there been talk about that in your committee meetings, and what can you do, particularly since you will have money above your spending cap that you could utilize for other purposes?
So we have not been talking about this in children's because it really goes through education, and that's where it's been coming from. But there is a lot of conversation around this. I've been on speaking panels about it with providers who are very, very concerned. The same thing I'm sure you're hearing, because we know that providers are not at capacity, not because the need isn't there, but because they don't have enough of the teachers or the people in the classroom. So they've had to close down. So some are running at 70, 80% capacity when there's this enormous need for childcare. It's being discussed. That bill has not come before us in caucus. I don't know where it stands, but I know it's in the education side of things. Do you have anything more?
Well, I wish I had said early childhood is one of the things that we have to fund, and we're going to need to move outside the spending cap to do that. I mean, what you saw in appropriations, Universal preschool. So I met with the governor with a team of our legislators from the House, and Beth Bai, who is the commissioner of early childhood, was there, and we said, Governor, we have to increase both revenue and spending on these essential things, or we're paying for it in the long run. And with a surplus, I know you don't want to spend it all now, because we are spending down our constitutional required pension liability. We are already doing that, but with some of that excess, we need to address the professional workforce shortage. I call it a healthcare crisis. It's a workforce shortage, and it's not just Connecticut. Of course, it's across the country. But if we don't address that here, we are going to pay way more for it in the long run with the needs that we know that come out of this. And there's no reason we can't be the healthcare capital of the country rather than the insurance capital of the world. There's no reason, but we need to invest in that pipeline, in that workforce pipeline, and that's early childhood, but also the healthcare pipeline that we're losing nurses, teachers, CNAs. Ceci and I just came from the STAR Sherwood Island Walk and Roll, to benefit the IDD STAR organization that really serves a lot of folks from Weston as well as all of our towns. And the executive director told me she has a 20% vacancy in their staffing right now. These are community nonprofit to resource the IDD community in their homes, right? Day programs, supported living apartments and group homes.
And also
She said
workforce training.
And workforce training. For those folks to be out in the workforce, if they only pass the 1% increase that is in the appropriations budget right now, she said our vacancy will be 50% the next day, and they will not give us notice. And she's like, we'll close. And what happens to all of those adults with developmental disability? What happens? So we're on the ground. We're social workers, right? That's why we became legislators, and we're begging the governor to understand the crisis that we're facing, and with shame on us with this kind of surplus that we are not. I mean, I get it. We don't want to use money that's not going to be sustainable, but that's where we really have to look at our revenue sources too, and what's equitable and what's manageable for ongoing funding of our social services. I mean, early childhood is social services. It's not separate. It's part of that landscape that is essential.
And as Anne well knows, it's not just the IDD community and the early childhood. It's also retirement, nursing homes, elderly. We have this dearth of workers across the spectrum, and in part because we're not paying them. So right now, what they, for the nonprofits alone, there's only been a 1% increase
cost
of living presented,
which is like a minus if you think about inflation,
right? And they're asking for 9% increase. That was what the nonprofit community came to us and asked us for, and they're in the legislation. It's only 1%. That is not sustainable. It just isn't. You cannot keep people at the same level. So there's going to be so much conversation. I've already asked someone. So do you think, with this budget, are we going to end up in special sessions? Because I'm not sure we're going to be able to come to an agreement. I haven't heard an answer yet. Nobody wants to make that statement, but it's a concern that we're not going to be able to come to an agreement.
Well, I would urge the public to reach out to the governor and say, this is an emergency. We have tools at our disposal to address an emergency in the budget. We call it inflationary diversion, or whatever name you want to call it. It's not a gimmick. It's responsible stewardship of our state taxes to go towards those needs that are most, and the workforce needs are critical. I work for a nonprofit that had to lay off, in a nursing home and senior services, that had to lay off non-direct care positions because they had to address their $4 million deficit, and this is going to impact seniors all throughout our Fairfield County. So we're fighting for it, but you got to fight the governor. I mean, I like the governor. We're very friendly, but he needs to understand that this is impacting not just poor communities, but all communities. And he needs to, quite frankly, hear from you that there's the public will to do this, to do what we need to do to meet the moment.
Thank you. I know that we had, I don't know, is Casey still here? He had a question.
I'm going to ask him.
Oh, did he? Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
So, hi, let me switch glasses. Hold on a second.
We had a high school student who had a question.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Yeah. So my son Casey Lerner is a senior, and he applied to a lot of colleges and was fortunate enough to get into a lot. And after thought, he decided to accept say yes to Western Connecticut State University as an art major. Thanks. And then news started coming out recently. So he put this together saying, Connecticut state colleges and universities have recently been threatened with closings and budget cuts. As an incoming freshman at Western Connecticut State and someone who has friends and family in the CSCU system, I'm very concerned about this. Can you tell me what you plan to do to protect our state college and university system?
Fight for funding. Fight to fund them.
Right. It sort of follows on to the previous answer. It's again looking at the fact that we have this spending cap and budget cap, but is it an appropriate cap at this point? That vote was taken in January, and we know that we brought in more money since then beyond what the revenue expectations were. I think we need to go back because we cannot let our students who we want to grow and learn and come stay in Connecticut, we can't let them down. And right now, the way it's set up, we are going to do that. And honestly, it's not just the CCSU students, it's also the community college students. And we're developing a workforce. So to not fund the schools where your son is going to go does not make sense to me.
Nor does tuition increases. That
No.
is not the answer to put the burden on the students and the families themselves. I mean, Will Haskell, Ceci's predecessor, had a huge victory with passing debt-free community college, which he, really championed, and we've got to fund that as well.
And we're increasing it.
But we're increasing it in this session.
Yep.
But if we increase debt-free community college and we make college unaffordable, the math just doesn't add up, people. And we knew this was coming, right? This is the governor will say, well, the enrollment has been dropping, so we're adjusting, but inflation and the costs have been rising. So,
and the other part of that is there was so much money that was coming through from the federal government, and now they're going to go off a fiscal cliff because that money is not replicated. So,
well, that ends in 2 years, yes.
Yeah, right. But some of that is what the governor said that we had actually funded at the same level, but in fact we haven't because that calculation didn't include all the monies that had come down from the federal government.
We're well aware. There's a lot of folks in our districts that work at Western Con or CCSU or Norwalk Community College. There's a lot of folks living in our district that are really worried about their jobs. There's
another
a gentleman.
question. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to expose my ignorance here because I'm new to the state. So, is there enough votes in the legislature to override the governor's veto?
What I hope I'm not speaking out of term, but what I'm hearing is that we are going to pass a bipartisan budget that does all of this.
Yeah.
And I would think, especially if the governor hears from you, that he wouldn't veto that budget. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
That's what I was talking about before about special session for the budget discussions, because if the budget that we come up with and pass is different, significantly different, which it already is looking that way from the governor's budget, then there's going to be a lot of negotiations happening.
Mm-hmm.
So to Anne's point, hearing from all of you about what your priorities are is really important.
Okay.
No, we've
Thank
heard from you. I'm not sure the governor's heard from you.
Right, that's what I meant.
He's a good guy, but this is where the rubber hits the road.
Hi. There are three important pieces of legislation regarding voting rights, expansion of voting rights,
Yes.
I know, going through the session. So early voting, no excuse absentee voting, referendum, and the Connecticut Voting Rights Act. Could you just give us a brief update on the status of all three?
I'll take the first one, the early voting, because it just passed the House on Thursday after 5.5 hours of debate.
And 11 referenda.
And 11 amendments, which they'll have in the Senate as well. But it does fund 2 weeks for the big November election starting in 2024. 2024.
Yeah.
Yes, starting in 2024, not this, I was hoping we would get funding and pass it for this, election just as a dry run, but that was timing-wise too difficult. So 2 weeks of early voting in 2024 for the Novembers, 7 days for the presidential, or is it 4 days for the presidential primary and 7 days for the other primaries?
I think it's 4 for the presidential and 7 for the other. When
7
I read
for-
the bill, that's
yeah.
how I read it the other night.
So the big question is that all the small towns are like, how are we going to do this? The commitment is there for funding, for extra staff, for extra, accommodations, for new tabulators. I can't wait to see it all. But here's what's going to happen. If you normally do a school and you can't do that for 7 days, you're going to write to the Secretary of State for an exception to do it at your town hall, for instance, that you're already working in, or a town building that is already staffed, even though it's not necessarily handicapped accessible. But that will be okay. That will be accepted, because you can't just take over, commandeer the gymnasium because they're using it. So but it will be that regular place on voting day. So like that won't be your early voting place, but probably town hall will be, and it'll be 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. most days, with 2 days. 8 to 8. That's right, with 2 days, 8 to 8. I know it seems like a really big lift, and it is, for the clerks and for the registrars and for the teams that do this. The thinking was, in the final night before we voted, was, let's go for 2 weeks, which is really in the middle of what other states are offering. And if we need to adjust it, we can adjust it down or up, but that was the thinking, and that's what we stuck to, and we are confident it will get voted in the Senate, and that we'll get the money, because that was the big thing. If we don't get the money to really expand this, we can't do it. But the voters overwhelmingly voted for early voting in the referendum, and we want to honor that with the best early voting plan that we can manage. I think that was really the thinking.
And part of it was to have 2 weekends, because not everyone, to have the weekdays, because people who work on weekends, and versus the people who work during the week being able to vote on the weekend. So that's why it was 14 days. I know the Secretary of State had recommended 10 days, but 14 days is where we're going to start. And I'm just trying to think. The only thing that we're not going to be able to do same-day registration on, and I don't think this changed, was on the presidential primaries.
Presidential and the other primaries, you can register if you're unaffiliated one day, but you have to come back the next to vote.
Right.
In other words, you can't change your registration and vote that day.
And I was
in
really
early voting.
concerned about that, because I'm like, we're putting the burden on a voter to come twice. However, and I know this actually to be a fact, because someone told me this prior to the last presidential, was that sometimes people will change affiliation just to vote, to sway,
especially local.
in a primary.
Especially local.
So I wasn't really happy about the burden on the voter, but I guess I understand what the thinking is. I think it might be coming there this week.
This week, yeah.
See,
they want to do
very-
it fast.
This is the thing, is that it's like a black box. We don't know until we know what exactly. I mean, we have go lists of all of the bills, and we know what's ready, but until the night before or the morning of, we don't know what bills are actually being taken up. So when I got the early voting bill last week, because I thought we might get to it if the House had passed it. We thought we might get to it on Thursday in the Senate. I, read the whole thing, highlighted it, and paid attention to it. But now, it's not coming until next week.
Okay, so
The other two.
the only other thing I want to say about early voting is that the state will also bond some money for PR and communication to really communicate to the voters what your hours are, how to do it, so we can get used to it. So I wanted to also say that there's commitment that this is not going to be on the local registrars and clerks. So that's early voting, but no excuse absentee ballot voting. We have to vote through a simple majority this year, right?
I believe that's it.
Yep.
And it hasn't come up yet.
So what we expect that will happen, and then it'll go on a referendum in 2024.
Right.
Do you all know why we have to do it that way? It's because it's in the state constitution, and to change the state constitution about voting, we have to go through at least a 2/3 majority, 2 consecutive sessions, then put it on a referendum to the voters, which we finally did with early voting, and that's why we're rolling out early voting.
Right.
We don't ever want to have to go through that again, which is why we want to kind of get it as expansive as possible and then make adjustments.
And then the other question you asked.
Connecticut Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, do we?
I sponsored that
actually don't
last
know.
year, and I sponsored it this year, and we had a press conference about it, and we're pushing hard. The question is going to be whether we have the time, because there's opposition, and anything that gets talked for hours loses momentum in terms of its priority, because there's so many priorities. So I hope so, because it's basically based on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and for gosh sakes, Connecticut ought to be leading. Connecticut ought to be standing strong for voting rights, for reproductive health rights, for privacy rights, for human rights. We ought to be leading, because we see these threatened in a national landscape in a very, very gun safety rights. We also co-sponsored, we ran on this, right?
Right.
We co-sponsored basically the governor's bill on gun safety legislation, tightening that up. Not because we're not one of the first in the country, but because we have more to do, and every day it becomes more and more apparent why we need safe storage for everyone, why we need to, limit ammunition and gun purchases to 1 a month.
And carry permits.
And carry permits, right.
Yeah.
So that's one of our priorities. I hope it, again, it doesn't hurt to hear from you all, and we just escalate that up to our leadership, saying we've got to vote on this. Yes, it's a budget year. Yes, there's a lot going on, but there's a lot at stake.
Another question?
Woody.
Yep, Woody?
Yeah, and I have to leave after this. It's not because of the answer to your question. But I'm trying to understand the rationale for changing the character of towns like Weston and Easton and Reading by requiring high-rise facilities and so forth, multi-person dwellings.
I think you're misinformed about that. There is no viable legislation that's requiring the changing of that kind of.
Well, but I think what you're speaking to is the fair share housing bill that came through, where if after 10 years a municipality has not met their goals, the 1 acre zoning could be turned, every acre could be turned into 20 housing units. That is not going anywhere. That bill is not going to be voted on. It's been, aspects of it have been taken into the Live, Work, Ride bill, but we haven't seen that legislation yet. They're still talking about it. You haven't seen it yet, have you?
Nope.
Okay. But housing is an issue. We know that housing is an issue. Doing something like that, I mean, that was a no-go for me from the start. And I voted again. I spoke against it in public hearing and ceded my time to Danielle Dobin out of Westport, who is like a housing guru, understands it. It's 6 ways to Sunday. So it was better for them to hear her speak than me. But it's not something that I support.
Well, what I do support is small towns like Weston, Easton, and Reading making meaningful progress, developing your village district. Creating some safety sidewalk features to encourage walking and riding, and the governor and the state stand ready to provide meaningful resources like sewer, septic, water infrastructure things to doing basically increasing your continuum of housing. Can you have some small apartments? Can you have some small townhouses like Reading does? Can you have some, two-family homes, little microclusters? You have experienced that a lot of your many seniors, many young people, many divorcees can't afford to live in their big homes, and so they must leave this community that they love because there isn't a viable option for them to stay and live here. There's no rentals, meaningful rentals. Can we grandfather in? You've already taken steps to create accessory dwelling unit statute. I want to encourage all of our communities to make meaningful progress in increasing and meeting the need that is here, because that would keep our talent here, keep it local, our best educated students, rather than going to, Oakland or Brooklyn or wherever else. We want them to come back here, but we've got to create meaningful progress on creating those options.
And I do also want to say about that, the sidewalks and building the community. Weston's doing a really good job of that. I mean, you have been looking at how do you rearrange your town center, and I know there are a lot of improvements coming on that front. And so you're doing it. You're doing the work. I think it just needs to keep being moved forward.
Well, that's good news. I mean, leave it to the towns to make their own decisions as opposed to imposing a one-size-fits-all kind of solution.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Although I do think, and there is an enormous need for housing. I don't want to diminish that at all. And there's something like 25,000 less housing units in Fairfield County than what we need.
And we need 90,000 across the state.
Yeah, and I want to also make the very big distinction between affordable housing and subsidized housing. We're not talking necessarily about creating all Section 8 housing or, low-income housing. We're talking about housing. Housing is important. It is an energy, an economic driver for the state. And so we do have to be looking at it in every town. How do we make this work?
And the resources are there. We're getting a lot of federal resources opening up to Biden's last couple of acts, and I want our districts to get some of that, right? And it comes through the state, and you got to work with your COGS, your Council of Governments, and they have the technical expertise to apply for some of these grants, some of these community change grants. Every time I get an alert about one of these grants or one of these opportunities, I immediately send it to all three of my town leadership. I was like, let's get on this. Let's capture some of those resources, because the towns that are doing nothing, eventually they will have some.
They'll be left out.
Yeah, not only will they be left out, but there will be some sort of enforcement mechanism 10 years down the road or whatever. Let's just be, proactive.
Another question?
Hello.
Hold on one second. And I think we started a little bit late. Are you guys okay to stay a little longer?
Just a little
longer.
'cause
Okay.
I actually have to be someplace else.
Okay.
Next, so
Okay,
sorry about that.
So we'll just go over maybe 5-10 minutes. or
Sure,
something.
that'd be
Okay.
great.
All right, thank you.
So just a quick follow-up if you can. So when you say that bill is dead, is there something else in the works? Are you guys supporting? I hear you say that you're supporting some of the more, affordable housing, smaller housing, or, developing some of the areas in Weston to have those smaller kind of units. What's currently in place? What's currently on the table for that's being evaluated if that particular Fair House bill is currently dead in the water?
So one of the bills is called Live, Work, Ride, and that's the one that I believe is still alive. I know that the the fair. It is, but
and
there
adjacent districts, which
Yeah.
we would be adjacent because we don't have any public transportation here. But you would also qualify for some, again, infrastructure resources if you wanted to do your own septic sewer, water line kind of thing for your village district. Yeah, it's mostly trying to support, and Reading is trying to be a transit-oriented district, so we would be an adjacent district and qualify for some of those first-in-line resources.
So the other bill, the Live Work Ride bill, is going to incorporate some pieces of the fair share bill, but we don't know what. It's all a negotiation. It hasn't been presented to us yet. So reading the bill as it stands inside the Connecticut General Assembly website isn't going to really give us a full indication on both of those bills what is going to make it through. But yes, I do support the idea of housing, always keeping that balance between what can the municipalities do. Like, for example, here, you've no sewers. So how are you going to make that work? I understand there's a possibility of some land around the Lilies in that area. I have no idea. I mean, this is just what I heard last year. But if there's something that can be done, I'm sure that the town is looking at how to do it.
Thank you.
Aaron Gorman Kirk.
How is everyone?
Good.
I just wanted to ask.
Hold on one second. Let me just get the mic to you. Thank you.
Hi, Erin Gorman Kirk here. I know that Ms. Representative Hughes is aware of this, but I wanted the senator to also be aware. We had a closed-door meeting with Ginny Ray Clay of the Social Equity Commission last week. We brought our social equity individuals up to the Capitol on some of the regulations going through that allow them some funding and some education. And I'm on the RESET program, which is educating our cohort. We have found a couple of things are impeding us, and we have a statutory requirement to get up and running in 14 months for certain licenses and 3 years and a day for other licenses. And Ms. Clay has described that she's got a staff allocation of 13, but only 5 individuals working there. So I just wanted to encourage you to see if we can get some of these people staffed, some of these agencies staffed. I don't say, throw the wrong people in, but I know that Ms. Clay has said she's put up 8 people and no one has even gotten back to her. She's in danger of losing a $6 million budget on June 30th if she doesn't spend it. She's trying to give $1 million allocations to various, she's given away $5 million to different United Ways last Tuesday. But in talking to government officials, and I've met with Jason Rojas and Mike D'Agostino on this, they need to be aware that the lack of staffing is going to put an economic issue at the forefront. I don't know if you know that I'm talking about the cannabis laws. If we
No,
don't
I
get the
didn't
cannabis
actually.
stores up within the statutory requirement, we will lose millions and millions and millions of dollars in community reinvestment funding. As some of you know, my background is working with veterans, and I've been working on Capitol Hill on this for about 20 years, work with Senator John Tester and others on VA bills, and to come to my own lobby day last week and find out that we're simply understaffed, underfunded. No one's representing the veterans. Representative Nolan out of New London was just almost sobbing when he found out some of our veterans and other license holders will miss the deadline, and therefore their licenses will be taken away. That means not only do you not have medicine for our veterans and seniors, it means we don't have tax revenue. It means other states around us will continue to see those revenues, like New York and Massachusetts. I know the CT Visit has a cannabis stopover part of their website because they don't want people to drive through the state. So I just encourage you to please make sure that we are in all our administrative offices. Department of Consumer Protection is also lacking a lot of people, and therefore we can't get the business at hand done. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I've heard this same issue in almost every agency at the state. And it has something to do with, and you probably know more about this as usual than I do, because you've been there longer and have a pretty good handle on things. But I've heard it has something to do with holdups in administration.
DAS, yeah.
Yeah, when they
Department of
start to
Administrative
look
Services.
they aren't passing things through fast enough. I know SD, State Department of Education, is having the same problem. So
Yeah. it's a microcosm of really state government is supposed to work for the people, right? For the people of the state. And if it's understaffed, and this is heartbreaking in DSS, we have one, for instance, Aaron is talking about the recent cannabis legalization, which is supposed to be, we're supposed to have the best social equity program in the country. But the reality on the rollout of the ground is less than desirable. We're supposed to reinvest the revenue back into disproportionately impacted communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs and that are underfunded and underinvested in historically by Connecticut policymakers. So we are determined to get that right, but part of that has to be getting the people to actually staff the rollout. And for instance, we have a wonderful ombudsman, Mairead Painter, for all the nursing homes and all the, complaints about, widespread neglect in nursing homes. She is losing several of her people are leaving, and we've asked for increased staffing, but they're burned out. They're burned out, and these are people that have to go and investigate complaints that, people are lying in their own feces, aren't getting turned, aren't getting, meals anywhere on time and hot and that kind of stuff, aren't being fed in appropriate ways to make sure they don't choke. And as a result, people are dying. People are dying. They're choking. They're dying. And this is why I'm saying there is a Republican budget that was proposed to just not fill these vacant staff agencies on the state level. That is not acceptable. We need to speed up the hiring. We need to fund the hiring and get appropriate people at the table to roll out the services that we have, because like Aaron's talking about, the veterans depend on this for their health, and we can't leave them behind. But if we don't fill agencies, which is what part of the governor's plan to balance the budget is, it'll be catastrophic. It'll be catastrophic.
So that is actually what you just said was something I was getting ready to say. What I've discovered up in Hartford is that things don't get stood up. The legislation passes, the money is appropriated.
Children's mental health.
And then things are not stood up. The programs are not put in place. I'm a little stunned by it, to tell you the truth.
Right. Well, we funded historic mental health in children's last year, and we have no funding for it this year.
Well,
we used ARPA dollars. We used ARPA dollars to fund it last year in, school-based mental health centers, services.
And they still haven't gotten the money.
Mobile services, and they haven't gotten the money. Adult day programs still haven't gotten their money. Adult day programs.
And so, we're talking about in the SB2 this year, the Children's Mental Health Bill coming out of the Senate, we're talking about setting up an office of behavioral health advocate. And I'm very concerned about it, because if we're going to appropriate the money, which I've been told by appropriations it's going to happen, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip, it seems, up in Hartford. And how are we going to make sure that, yes, we've already passed this legislation, yes, it's appropriated, but nothing happens? So that's part of
accountability season.
That we have to stay on top of that, because we know that providers and patients, families, need to have a behavioral health advocate. There is a morass, and people don't know how to negotiate the mental health system. And so that's why we're doing this. But yet, anyway.
First of all, thank you very much for coming today and answering our questions. Talk about the business climate. I think we've heard a lot about how negative the business climate is in Connecticut. And for companies to stay, they need tax breaks, other incentives. A lot of us think maybe we're paying too much in taxes, or maybe not enough. But anyway, the tax burden. So how are you guys going to square the circle, solve the contradiction between the needs that we've heard so much about this morning, education, social services, all of that, with the, shall we say, the threat of less funding available, higher taxes.
Well, we have a couple of different things in the pipeline. I mean, the governor's Office of Workforce Strategy is really working hard to develop a workforce for these highly skilled and needed jobs and offer tax credit. We have several bills about offering student loan, reimbursement and offering to businesses tax credits for student loan forgiveness if a employee works 5 years or more. So it's like, what do we do about the whole landscape? We're paying some of the highest energy costs in the country. That really impacts businesses. So we're trying to rein that in with our regulatory environment for our energy. It's not just one thing. It's not just tax rates. It's like energy costs, housing, staffing, and an economic driver. I mean, the economic numbers coming out in terms of the Labor Department are pretty good in this last quarter. The governor's very proud of that. Unemployment is down. Our jobs added are good. But in what sectors, and how are we getting the increase in revenue boosts? Our tax receipts are looking good. We have $250 million more at the end of April in terms of tax receipts than we expected. So that's good. Is that going to continue? What does that landscape look like?
Well, but part of it is also creating workforce. So the Office of Workforce Strategy, there are there's work being done at the. So let me back up. Higher Education Committee is also the Committee of Workforce Advancement. So we've been doing a lot of talking about how do we increase the training of our students so that we can make sure that if we have a workforce, if a company comes here, we can have a workforce that will be there to do the work. Because bringing in additional companies is not going to be good if we don't have any way for them to staff up. So housing plays into that, but also workforce plays into it. So there has been efforts in place and bills coming through that will be addressing the workforce training. And in particular, there's one that I really like that starts looking at skill sets and skill development at high school to engage students earlier on so that they know where they want to go, so there's less time lost when they get to college. Other than that, I think Anne's points are really well taken in that the workforce, the Office of DECD, they have been doing a lot of work for the first time going outside of Connecticut and bringing companies into Connecticut, which has never happened before. So it's only in, say, the last 5 years that we've actually been going out and looking at companies and bringing them in. And that work there's a lot of work in the hopper on that, but not, I don't have
There are
any names.
tax credits for certain sectors. There's a lot of tax credits going to advanced manufacturing, biotech, biohealth. I'm not sure. There's like two others that there are a lot of tax credits
Construction and manufacturing.
But the green sectors, there's big tax credits going to the green sectors of the economy. But I also want to mention WBDC, the Women's Business Development Council, offers microgrants and technical assistance and business administration to really help women-owned business and women leadership run their own business, open new businesses. There are also, the Small Business Council is also trying to really jumpstart and encourage entrepreneurship and small businesses. There's makerspace. There's a lot of money going into that kind of thing with 3D printers and to encourage people. The big thing that is hampering, I think, entrepreneurship and small business development is healthcare. They can't afford healthcare for their families. if they're not working for a big company that offers healthcare. Healthcare has become untenable. Healthcare insurance, healthcare costs, medical debt. But we do have a program that we are funding that we will pass, Covered Connecticut, that covers that tranche of folks that don't qualify for Medicaid and make just a little bit too much for that, for premium and deductible free health insurance with very robust coverage that you can buy on the exchange.
I think we'll do, because we've gone a little over, one more question, if that's possible. Maybe. And then if you guys have anything else that you want to wrap up with after that, anything that you think we missed that we should know about. But is there another question here?
I'd like to just wrap up because I actually have to be someplace at 1.
All right.
So I'd really look forward to coming back, and hopefully we can do another town hall.
Sure.
When the session is over.
Sure.
And can bring actual answers to you about what legislation passed, where we see it going, and what we think the impact is of that legislation. So I look forward to coming back again, and I have absolutely loved this new job. I am so glad to be representing the 8 towns that I represent, and I'm so glad to be able to meet in forums like today, to be able to hear your concerns about business, concerns about housing, concerns about social equity. That's important to me. So please, if you have things that you are thinking about and you want me to know, please send me an email. I have one of the best aides in the world. He was Will Haskell's aide. He is absolutely fantastic at making sure that I'm talking to the right people, that I hear the questions that come through, and we will always get back to you. So please reach out to me if you've got concerns or something has not come up that you want me to know about.
Your Senator, Ceci Maher.
Thank you. And do you have any final things you think we need to know
when
about?
we come back, and let's schedule something, I will have summaries for you, summaries for acts affecting children, summaries for acts affecting seniors, summaries affecting municipalities, and acts affecting economic development for the 2023 session. So I'd be happy to distribute that all, and all of you policy wonks can double down, and hopefully we'll have a lot of successes to report on.
And when's the session over?
June 7th.
At midnight.
Give us a couple of days, though. Do not schedule it after that.
June 8th, 8 a.m.
Yeah. No, please don't.
Well, thank you
Please
so
don't.
much. I really
Thank
appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for coming today.
All right.